I still remember the taste of real bread. Not the reconstituted starch blocks we synthesized in Old 7, but actual bread from grain grown in soil under a sun. My mother baked it in our hab unit on Cipra Mundi when the ration allotments permitted flour instead of protein paste. The crust cracked when you broke it. The interior was soft. I was 19 when I last ate it, 2 weeks before the Munitorum assessors identified my aptitude for logistics mathematics and conscripted me into the Departamento Munitorum Supply Corps. That was in 723. M41. The bread memory is one of 3 things I can still recall with absolute clarity from before. The others are my mother's hands. She had a scar across her left palm from a pressing accident, and the specific shade of gray the morning sky turned when the Factorum smog mixed with dawn. Everything else from that life exists now as degraded data, impressions without detail, names without faces. The Munitorum training facility on Bakor processed us in groups of 200. They shaved our heads. They issued us uniforms that smelled of recycled fiber and industrial detergent. They seated us in lecture halls with cogitators built into the desks and taught us the mathematics of supply, not simple arithmetic. The complex algorithmic projections required to feed, arm, and fuel the Imperium's endless wars across lightless void and hostile worlds. I learned that a standard Imperial Guard infantry company requires 470 kilograms of food per day at baseline nutrition levels. I learned that this figure scales exponentially with force size, but not linearly, because command staff and specialized units require different nutritional profiles. I learned that storage space is measured not just in volume but in mass, because excess weight degrades ship performance and increases fuel consumption. I learned that food preservation is a race against entropy, that the Imperium fights with radiation treatment, chemical stabilization, void freezing, and when necessary, prayer to the machine god. I learned that people starve, not because the Imperium lacks food in aggregate, but because the mathematics of getting food from where it exists to where it is needed collapses under the realities of warp travel. Supply line raids, administrative error, and the simple physical impossibility of storing 20 years of provisions for 4 million souls. They told us this plainly in week 7 of training. Logistics Officer Secundus Van, a man whose left eye had been replaced with a calculation augmetic that clicked when he blinked, stood before our lecture hall and stated it as fact. You will condemn men to death through arithmetic. This is your function. You will calculate who eats and who does not. You will make these calculations correctly, or more will die than necessary. The Imperium requires your competence, not your compassion. I scored in the 94th percentile on the final certification examinations. They promoted me to Logistics Officer Tertius and assigned me to Battlefleet Tempestus, Crusade Fleet designation Ardent Sword. Assembling at the Backer orbital yards for a projected 20-year reconquest campaign in the Veiled region. 200 ships, 4 million personnel including Imperial Guard regiments, naval armsmen, Adeptus Mechanicus support staff, and a small contingent of Astartes advisors from the Silver Skulls chapter. My specific assignment, nutritional supply coordination, fleet-wide. I was 23 years old. I had never managed anything larger than my own ration consumption. They gave me a staff of 40 junior logistics personnel, access to the fleet's central supply cogitator network, and 6 months before fleet departure to calculate how we would feed 4 million humans for 2 decades. The first thing I learned was that we could not. The second thing I learned was that we would attempt it anyway. I ran the initial projections in my assigned office aboard the fleet flagship, the Retribution-class battleship Unshakable Verdict. My cogitator desk hummed with processing strain as it crunched the variables. 4 million personnel, 20 years, baseline nutritional requirements per standard human per day, 1.8 kilograms of food matter, minimum 2,000 calories, essential vitamins synthesized or supplemented. I factored in variance for naval ratings versus Guard infantry versus Mechanicus personnel whose augmentations reduced biological consumption. I factored in attrition, Expected casualties would reduce consumption over time. I factored in resupply opportunities at captured worlds, though these were marked as uncertain variables. The cogitator returned the primary figure, 9.4 million metric tons of food stores required at fleet departure. I checked the calculation. I ran it again with adjusted parameters. The figure held. I accessed the fleet cargo manifests. Our 200 ships included 43 dedicated supply haulers, stripped of weapons to maximize cargo capacity. Together, they could carry 6.1 million metric tons of provisions if we utilized every available hold and accepted reduced fuel margins. The shortfall was 3.3 million metric tons. Approximately 35% of required provisions, 7 years of food that did not exist in our holds. I submitted the report to my immediate superior, Logistics Officer Secundus Crane, a woman who had served with Battlefleet Tempestus for 16 years, and whose left hand trembled constantly from what I later learned was early-stage nerve degeneration from stim dependency. She read my report in silence for 4 minutes. Then she looked at me with an expression I could not identify. "This is correct," she said. I waited. "You understand what this means?" she said. I did not then, not fully. I said, "We cannot carry sufficient provisions for the Crusade duration." "No," she said, "we cannot. Nor could any Crusade fleet of comparable size. The Imperium does not provision for success, it provisions for acceptable loss." She explained it to me then. The fleet would depart with what it could carry. We would supplement through capture of enemy food stores. Agricultural worlds we conquered would be tithed immediately, their production redirected to fleet supply. We would forage. We would render down captured livestock, process alien vegetation through testing protocols, reclaim biological matter from casualties when necessary. We would ration. When rationing proved insufficient, we would prioritize. Fleet command, Astartes, specialized personnel, they would eat. Line infantry, lower deck crew, penal conscripts, they would eat less. And when even that proved insufficient, some would not eat at all. "This is why we exist," Crane said, "not to feed everyone, to calculate who starves in what order such that the crusade continues. Do you understand?" The tremor in her hand seemed to worsen. She dismissed me. I returned to my office and did not sleep that night. I ran secondary projections. If we rationed immediately to 80% baseline nutrition, we extended our supplies by 2.3 years. If we dropped to 70%, we gained 4.1 years, but incurred efficiency losses from malnutrition that would degrade combat effectiveness by estimated 12%. If we implemented tiered rationing, full nutrition for essential personnel, reduced for support, minimal for expendable, we could theoretically sustain for 11 years before critical supply failure. 11 years, not 20. And that assumed no supply line disruption, no warp, travel delays, no spoilage beyond projected parameters, and successful capture of enemy food stores every 8 months. The Crusade launched on schedule. I watched from an observation blister on the unshakable verdict as 200 ships broke orbit from Bacca and assembled into formation. The largest vessels formed the core, battleships and cruisers whose plasma drives burned like newborn stars. The troop carriers and supply haulers clustered in protective formation. The escort frigates and destroyers ranged at the formation edges. We translated into the warp 3 hours later. The Geller fields engaged. I felt the shift as real space abandoned us. I had reviewed the provisions loaded in every cargo hold. 6.1 million metric tons of food, dried protein blocks, grain stores in radiation-sealed containers, frozen meat slabs in cryo-holds held at -40 degrees. Vitamin supplement pills manufactured in bulk by Mechanicus pharmaceutical facilities. Water reclamation systems that would process and reprocess every liquid in the fleet until the recycled output tasted of metal and chemicals, but remained technically potable. Algae vats that cultured nutritional paste from biological waste input. Fungus farms in the lower holds that grew edible matter in darkness, fed on decomposing organic material. We fed them in continuous cycle. It was an efficient system. It was inadequate. I knew this. Everyone with access to the supply figures knew this. We launched anyway because the Imperium does not delay crusades for logistics impossibilities. We launched because the reclamation of the Veiled region was deemed strategically necessary. We launched because the God Emperor required it, and what the Emperor requires, the Imperium provides, even when providing means spending lives like currency. The first year proceeded within projected parameters. We made 3 real space transitions to bypass warp storms, added 8 weeks to our timeline but encountered no significant delays. We conquered our first target world, a forge moon designated Epsilon, Sigma 7 that had fallen to heretic control. The ground campaign lasted 6 weeks. The Astartes led the assault. The Guard regiments secured the facilities. I coordinated the immediate seizure of all food production and storage. We recovered 200,000 metric tons of preserved protein. Most of it was derived from sources I did not examine too carefully. The heretics had maintained production through methods that violated Imperial food safety protocols, but nutritional analysis confirmed it would not poison our personnel. We loaded it into our supply haulers. I recalculated our projections. The captured supplies extended our timeline by 7 months. I submitted the report. Fleet Command acknowledged it. No celebration, no commentary, simply acknowledged. I met him during the Epsilon Sigma 7 ground campaign coordination. Fleet logistics required liaison with Guard Command to prioritize supply distribution during the assault. The Guard regiments rotated through supply depot access on the unshakable verdict for resupply before drop operations. I was supervising the distribution queue when a colonel from the Cyprian 19th Regiment arrived with his command squad. Colonel Merik. I remember his name because he was from Cypramundi, my world. I had not met anyone from home since my conscription 8 years prior. He was perhaps 15 years older than me, his face weathered by campaigns I could not imagine. He wore the Cyprian gray and black uniform without ostentation. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, old enough to have faded but deep enough to remain prominent. His eyes were dark and tired in a way that suggested he had stopped expecting rest. He noticed my uniform designation tag. Cypra Mundi, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir, I said. Conscripted in 723. I left before your regiment was raised. We raised in 728, he said. 5 years after the tithe assessors decided Cypra needed to contribute more than factory output. His voice carried no bitterness, simply statement. You remember the bread? The question surprised me enough that I answered honestly. Yes. My mother baked it when the rations permitted flour. Something shifted in his expression briefly before the professional mask returned. My wife did the same. Before. He did not elaborate on before what. We spoke for perhaps 6 minutes while his command squad collected their supply allotments. He told me the Cyprian 19th had served for 9 years across 4 campaigns prior to this crusade. He did not tell me casualty figures, but the weariness in his voice suggested they had been significant. I told him I managed nutritional supply for the fleet. He asked me directly if we had enough food. I should have deflected. I should have provided the approved response about adequate provisions and the Emperor's providence. Instead, I told him the truth. No, we will ration. Eventually, we will prioritize. He looked at me for several seconds. How long? 11 years if conditions remain optimal. Less if they do not. Impassed. And after 11 years? Starvation, I said. Systematically managed to preserve essential combat capability as long as possible. He nodded slowly. Then we had better conquer quickly. He gathered his allotment packs. Before leaving, he looked back at me. Thank you for honesty. It is rarer than food. I encountered him 7 more times over the next 3 years. Brief interactions, supply requisitions, logistics coordination meetings, 1 dinner in the junior officers' mess when our duty schedules aligned. We did not become friends in any traditional sense. We simply recognized something in each other. Two people from the same gray morning sky, trying to perform our functions in a machine that consumed worlds. He told me about the campaigns, the attrition mathematics, how many men he had lost on which worlds. He spoke about it the way I spoke about food tonnage. Necessary data, catalogued clinically because emotional processing would degrade function. He had commanded 800 men when the regiment formed. After 9 years, 412 remained. The replacements came from other decimated Cyprian regiments, folded together to maintain unit designation. Most of them were not from Cypramundi anymore. They were just soldiers wearing Cyprian colors. I told him about the supply situation, the degradation curve. The ration reductions I have been ordered to implement starting in year 2, from 100% baseline to 90% for non-essential personnel. He asked me what non-essential meant. I told him, lower deck crew, penal labor conscripts, support staff without specialized skills. He asked if that included line infantry. I told him it would, eventually. How eventual, he asked. Year 4, I said, if projections hold. They will not hold, he said. Not accusation, observation. He was correct. Year 3, the warp translation to our 4th target system went wrong. I was not privy to the specifics. Navigator difficulties, warp currents, demonic interference, the usual cascade of factors that make warp travel a prayer more than a science. We emerged 6 months off schedule and 3 systems away from intended translation point. The detour required 2 additional warp jumps and cost us 11 months of travel time against our operational timeline. 11 months. I recalculated immediately. Our supply consumption continued during warp travel. 4 million people eating every day, even while the ships drifted through unreality. The delay consumed 540,000 metric tons of provisions, supplies meant to carry us through the next phase of Conquest. I implemented emergency rationing protocols. 90% baseline for essential personnel, 75% for support staff, 60% for expendable categories. The Mechanicus personnel barely noticed. Many of them ate less anyway, their augmentations reducing biological need. The naval ratings grumbled but adapted. The guard regiments noticed. Hunger is not immediate. It accumulates. At 75% nutrition, the human body adapts for weeks before degradation becomes apparent. At 60%, adaptation becomes deprivation. Energy levels drop. Cognitive function slows. Physical performance degrades. Immune systems weaken. These changes manifest gradually, but they manifest. The medical officers began submitting reports in month 6 of the emergency rationing. Increased sick calls. Malnutrition symptoms appearing in lower-tier personnel. 3 deaths attributed to complications from nutritional deficiency. Infections the soldiers should have survived, but their bodies could not fight effectively while starving. 3 deaths. I logged them. I submitted the updated projections. If we maintained current rationing, we would lose approximately 4% of personnel to malnutrition-related complications before we conquered a resupply world. If we increased rations, we would exhaust supplies faster and risk complete supply failure. Fleet Command chose the former. 4% losses were acceptable against the risk of systemic collapse. I received the order. I implemented it. I did not sleep well for several weeks, but I implemented it. We conquered the 4th target world in year 4. An agri-world designated Talos Prime that had been infested by orc invaders. The campaign was brutal. Orcs do not surrender, and they had fortified the agricultural zones we needed to capture intact. The guard regiments took heavy casualties. The Cyprian 19th was deployed in the primary assault. I monitored casualty reports from my logistics station, watching the numbers update in real time. Colonel Merik survived. 216 of his regiment did not. We seized the agri-world's food stores. 300,000 metric tons of grain, preserved vegetables, and processed protein. The orcs had not understood the value of what they occupied. They simply ate what they wanted and let the rest rot. We salvaged what we could. It extended our timeline by 9 months. Not enough. Never enough. I saw Merik 2 weeks after the Talos Prime campaign concluded. He came to my office personally to submit a formal requisition for increased rations for his regiment. They had been at 60% baseline for 8 months. Combat effectiveness was degraded. Morale was failing. He needed his men fed properly. I had the figures in front of me. I showed him the projections. If I increased guard rations to 100% baseline, we would exhaust supplies in 6.2 years. We were only 4 years into a 20-year crusade. I cannot approve this, I said. He looked at me across my desk. His face had thinned. I had not noticed before, but he was hungry too. Officers ate better than line infantry, but not by much. My men are starving, he said quietly. I know, I said. They are fighting, they are dying. They are doing what the Imperium requires. And they are starving while they do it. I know, I said again. He leaned forward. Then feed them. I cannot. If I feed your regiment properly, I must feed all guard regiments properly. If I feed all guard regiments properly, we will run out of food before the crusade completes. More will die from starvation than currently die from malnutrition. You are asking me to send starving men into combat. I am telling you that I have no choice. Neither do you, neither do they. Something happened in his expression then. Not anger, resignation. The look of a man who had hoped for a different answer, but had expected exactly this one. He stood. Then I will inform them that the Emperor provides, and what the Emperor provides is 60% rations and glory in his name. He left. I sat in my office and stared at the calculations on my cogitator screen until the numbers blurred together into meaningless symbols. That night, I reviewed the fleet cannibalism protocols for the first time. They existed in the supply regulations as Contingency Omega 7, reclamation of biological resources in extremis. The language was clinical. In the event of catastrophic supply failure, deceased personnel could be processed for nutritional reclamation. The protocols specified preparation methods, chemical treatment to eliminate pathogens, and distribution procedures. It was filed under emergency measures, alongside protocols for void evacuation and ship scuttling. I had known the protocols existed. I had never read them in detail. Now I did. I learned that human tissue, properly processed, yields approximately 40% usable nutritional matter. I learned that chemical treatment eliminates most health risks. I learned that the Imperium had calculated exactly how many dead soldiers it took to feed one living soldier for 1 month. I did not submit any reports regarding these protocols. I simply archived the information in my personal cogitator files and tried not to think about it. Year 5. We conquered 3 more worlds. Each conquest yielded supplies. Never enough. The mathematics did not improve. They simply degraded more slowly than worst-case projections. I implemented further ration reductions. 50% baseline for expendable categories, 65% for support staff, 80% for essential personnel. The deaths increased, not dramatically, not in ways that threatened combat effectiveness. Just steady accumulation. Malnutrition complications, infections, injuries that should have healed but did not because the bodies were too depleted. The medical reports documented it all with clinical precision. I read every report. I logged every death. I updated the projections. Fewer mouths to feed meant supplies lasted longer. This was mathematically accurate. It was also monstrous. I did not say this to anyone. I saw Merik less frequently. The Cypern 19th was deployed in heavy combat rotations. They had developed a reputation for reliability, which meant they were assigned the worst operations. When we did interact, our conversations grew shorter. There was less to say. He knew his men were hungry. I knew I could not feed them. We both knew this would continue until it ended. In Year 6, I was promoted to Logistics Officer Secundus. Crane had collapsed during a routine shift. Her heart failed, probably accelerated by years of stim use trying to compensate for exhaustion. They found her at her desk, face down in a pile of requisition forms. I was assigned her position and her responsibilities. I now managed all fleet supply, not just nutritional. Water reclamation, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies. Every resource the Crusade required to continue existing. I had a staff of 200. I had access to fleet command briefings. I had a larger office with a better cogitator. I had more deaths to calculate. The first time I authorized Contingency Omega, 7 was in year 7, we had suffered a catastrophic supply hauler loss. One of our ships, the Abundant Providence, had been destroyed in a void battle with traitor raiders. The ship had been carrying 9,000 metric tons of food stores. The loss represented 8 months of provisions in a single engagement. I ran the projections immediately. If we maintained current rationing, we would reach supply exhaustion in 3.6 years. If we reduced rations further, malnutrition deaths would spike beyond acceptable losses. We needed additional nutritional matter. The Abundant Providence had carried a crew of 4,000. 3,814 had died in the engagement. Their bodies were still aboard, frozen in the void-exposed sections of the destroyed ship. I submitted the request to Fleet Command. I used the proper terminology. Biological resource reclamation. I provided the yield calculations, approximately 600 metric tons of usable nutritional matter after processing. I noted that this would offset 43% of the loss. Fleet Command approved the request in under an hour. A salvage team was dispatched to the wreckage. They recovered what they could. The Mechanicus processed the remains in sealed chambers I never visited. The resulting matter was treated, packaged, and distributed into the general food supply without specific identification. No one was told. The supply manifests listed it as reclaimed protein, emergency provisions. I knew. The processing overseers knew. Fleet Command knew. Everyone else simply ate what they were given and did not ask questions they did not want answered. Colonel Merik's regiment received their portion. I reviewed the distribution logs. They had no way of knowing. I did not tell him. What purpose would it serve? I saw him one final time in year 8. The Cypran 19th had been assigned to the vanguard assault on a fortress world designated Gorum Praxis. The enemy was well entrenched, renegade guard regiments that had turned from the Emperor's Light and fortified a continent-spanning defense network. The campaign projections estimated 6 months of grinding siege warfare. Merik came to my office 3 days before deployment to request increased combat rations for his regiment during the operation. I had the figures ready before he arrived. I always kept the Cypran 19th supply data immediately accessible, a habit I had never examined too closely. His regiment now numbered 143 effectives. Of the original 800 who had mustered on Cypra Mundi, fewer than 30 remained. The rest were replacements from other broken units, wearing Cypran colors without Cypran origins. Merik himself looked like he had aged 20 years in the 8 we had served. His face had hollowed. The scar tissue on his jaw stood out more prominently against his thinned features. His hands, when he placed them on my desk, showed the fine tremor of prolonged malnutrition. "I need full rations," he said without preamble. 100% baseline for 6 months. My men cannot fight effectively at current levels. They had been at 55% baseline for 11 months. Combat effectiveness ratings have declined by 18% according to command assessments. Medical reports showed chronic fatigue, slower reaction times, increased injury rates during training exercises. "I can authorize 70% for the duration of the combat operation," I said. "Elevated to 85% for frontline assault personnel during active engagement periods. That is not sufficient. It is what exists." I turned my cogitator screen toward him. Current fleet stores stand at 1.1 million metric tons. We are 8 years into the Crusade. We have 12 years remaining. If I elevate all combat units to full rations during operations, we will exhaust supplies in 4.3 years. We were supposed to have resupply by now. The projections indicated. The projections were optimistic, I interrupted. We have captured less than anticipated. We have lost more ships than projected. The warp delays have cost us 18 months of additional consumption. The mathematics have not improved. Then we will starve. Yes, I said. Some of us. Eventually most of us. But not yet. Not if we continue managing resources efficiently. He looked at me then with an expression I had not seen from him before. Something between horror and recognition. Efficiently, you mean letting us die slowly instead of quickly. I mean preserving combat capability as long as possible. Your regiment will receive 70% rations. You will fight at diminished capacity. You will take additional casualties because your men are not operating at full effectiveness. But the crusade will continue. That is my function. Your function is murder by arithmetic. The words should have hurt. Perhaps years earlier they would have. Now I simply process them as accurate assessment. Yes, I said. It is. He stood. He gathered the supply authorization data slate I had prepared. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and looked back at me. Do you remember what the bread tasted like? The question caught me unprepared. I had to reach for the memory, found it degraded, corrupted by time and repetition of lesser foods. I remember it was better than what we eat now. I cannot remember it at all anymore, he said quietly. I try sometimes, but the memory is gone. All I taste now is recycled protein and metal. I think perhaps that is what happens. The Imperium does not just consume our bodies, it consumes even our memory of what it was like to be fully human. He left before I could respond. I am not certain I would have had a response to offer. The Gorum Praxis campaign lasted 8 months, not 6. The enemy was more entrenched than intelligence had indicated. The Astartes led the breakthrough operations, but the Guard regiments bore the attrition warfare. Endless assaults against fortified positions, grinding through defenders who would not retreat. The casualty figures accumulated in my reports like sediment. I monitored the Cypern 19th's status throughout. They were assigned to a secondary assault vector, taking a fortress complex that controlled a supply route. The operation was deemed medium priority, important but not critical. They received their 70% rations as authorized. The assault took 11 days. They succeeded. They captured the objective. Of the 143 who deployed, 67 survived the operation. Colonel Merik was not among them. I received the casualty report on the 3rd day after the fortress fell. His name appeared in the command staff section. KIA, direct artillery strike on forward command post, remains unrecoverable due to structural collapse. The report was filed by his second-in-command, a lieutenant who had been promoted to acting commander of what remained of the regiment. I read the report 3 times. I archived it in the casualty database. I updated the personnel consumption projections. 67 mouths instead of 143 meant reduced supply requirements for the Cypern 19th. The mathematics improved slightly. I sat in my office for approximately 40 minutes after filing the report. I did not process anything during that time. I simply existed in a state of non-function, staring at my cogitator screen, while my mind failed to progress beyond a single repeating thought. He is dead. He died hungry. I could have fed him. I chose not to. The choice was mathematically correct. He died anyway. Eventually, I resumed function. There were supply requisitions to process. A water reclamation system on one of the troop carriers required maintenance allocation. Ammunition distribution for the ongoing campaign needed coordination. I returned to my duties because returning to duties was what remained. I did not attend any memorial service. The Cypern 19th held one, according to regimental records, but I was not invited and did not request permission to attend. I would not have known what to say. I am sorry I starved your commander to death for mathematically sound reasons did not seem appropriate. I accessed the processed protein distribution logs from 3 months prior. The matter reclaimed from the abundant Providence casualties had been distributed fleet-wide. Approximately 0.4 kilograms had gone to the Cypern 19th's allocation, standard distribution across all units receiving general provisions. Colonel Merik had eaten his own dead comrades without knowing it. This was not unique to him. We all had, by that point, anyone who consumed fleet rations had processed human matter in their diet. But I found myself calculating specifically his portion. 0.4 kilograms across 3 months, approximately 4.4 grams per day. Not enough to notice. Not enough to matter. Just enough for me to know that I had fed him the recycled dead, and then watched him die anyway. I deleted the calculation from my cogitator. The data was not operationally relevant. The Crusade continued. Year 9, Year 10, Year 11, we conquered worlds. We lost ships. The supplies diminished according to projections that became increasingly accurate as my models incorporated more data. I implemented further ration reductions. 45% baseline for expendable categories, 55% for support staff, 70% for essential personnel. The deaths increased proportionally. Malnutrition complications became the third leading cause of mortality after combat casualties and industrial accidents. Medical officers stopped submitting reports requesting intervention. They knew I had no intervention to provide. They simply documented the deaths and requisitioned body bags. We implemented Contingency Omega. 4 more times. A plague ship lost to warp corruption, its crew dead before we could recover them, but their bodies preserved in the void cold. A troop carrier destroyed in orbital bombardment. A mass casualty event during a failed planetary assault where we recovered 8,000 bodies from the battlefield. Each time, I submitted the reclamation authorization. Each time, the Mechanicus processed the remains. Each time, the resulting matter was distributed into general provisions without announcement. By year 12, approximately 11% of our nutritional intake was reclaimed human matter. This was logged in the classified supply databases as emergency protein supplementation, biological reclamation sources. Only personnel with logistics secundus clearance or higher had access to the specific breakdown. The rest of the fleet simply ate what they were given. I wondered sometimes if they knew, if they tasted something different, if they understood what the processed protein block's emergency variant really contained. No one asked. Perhaps they did not want to know. Perhaps they knew and chose not to acknowledge it. Ignorance and denial both served the same function, allowing them to continue existing without confronting what existence had become. I stopped trying to sleep in year 13, not intentionally. My body simply lost the capacity. I would lie in my bunk for the allocated rest period, but unconsciousness would not come. My mind continued processing supply calculations, running projections, optimizing distribution algorithms. After several months of this, I requisitioned stim rations from medical supplies and stopped pretending to rest. I worked 18-hour shifts, then 20-hour shifts. Eventually, my shifts simply continued until I collapsed from exhaustion, slept for 4 hours, and resumed. No one commented. Crane had done the same. The tremor in my hands developed in year 14. I logged it as expected symptoms of chronic stim use and continued. The isolation came in year 15. The unshakable verdict required extensive repairs after a void engagement with a traitor cruiser. The damage was severe enough that non-essential personnel were evacuated to other fleet vessels, while repair operations proceeded. As logistics secundus, I was deemed essential. I needed to remain aboard to coordinate supply distribution during the repair period. My staff was evacuated. I was assigned temporary quarters in an undamaged section and informed that repairs would take approximately 4 months. The repairs took 9 months. For the first 6 weeks, I maintained regular contact with other ships via Vox network. I processed requisitions remotely, coordinated supply transfers, maintained function. Then the communications array was taken offline for replacement. Repair operations required full system shutdown. I was informed that local Vox within the ship remained functional for emergency use. but fleet-wide communications would be unavailable for the duration of the array replacement. The array replacement took 7 months. I existed alone on a ship crewed by Mechanicus repair teams, who communicated in binary cant I could not understand, and who did not acknowledge my presence unless I directly interfaced with them regarding logistics matters. My office remained functional. My cogitator access remained active for local databases, but I had no external communication, no requests to process, no crises to manage, no purpose beyond existing in a small section of a vast ship that was being dismantled and rebuilt around me. I tried to maintain routine. I reviewed supply databases. I ran projections for scenarios that might occur. I optimized distribution algorithms that no one currently needed. I created reports that I could not submit. After 3 weeks, I ran out of productive work. The databases contained only historical data. The projections required updated fleet status I did not possess. The algorithms were already optimized to maximum efficiency. I began counting. The rivets in my office walls, the deck plates between my quarters and my office, the number of steps required to traverse the corridor outside my workspace. 3,217 rivets in the visible wall sections, 842 deck plates, 206 steps. I recounted them. The numbers matched. I counted them again, still matched. I tried to remember Cipra Mundi, the grey morning sky, my mother's hands, the taste of bread. I could retrieve the data. I knew these memories existed in my archive, but I could not access the sensory detail. It was like reading a report about someone else's life. I knew what I should remember, but I could not feel the memory. I tried to remember Colonel Merik's face, the scar on his jaw, the way his voice had sounded when he asked if I remembered the bread. I could access fragments. The scar existed, the conversation had occurred, but I could not reconstruct him as a complete person. He existed in my archive as data points. Supply requisitions he had submitted, casualty reports listing his regiment, the final KIA notification. I could not remember if his eyes had been brown or gray. I began talking to myself, not intentionally. I would be reviewing database entries and realize I had been narrating my actions aloud, accessing supply manifest for Year 7, cross-referencing casualty data, calculating consumption variance. My voice sounded strange in the empty office. Metallic, the acoustics were wrong without other humans present to absorb the sound. I stopped talking aloud. The silence was worse. On day 63 of isolation, I experienced what I later logged as a processing error. I was reviewing nutritional consumption data when I noticed an anomaly in the figures, a discrepancy of 0.03% in the Year 9 distribution logs. Statistically insignificant. Probably a rounding error in the cogitator calculations. I spent 11 hours analyzing the discrepancy. I broke down every supply transfer, every distribution calculation, every consumption report from that year. I tracked the data through 6 levels of archived records. Eventually, I located the source. A single requisition form that had been filed with incorrect unit designation, causing a minor classification error that propagated through the system. The error had no operational impact. It had never affected any distribution decision. It was purely an archival inconsistency. I corrected it in the database. I generated a correction report that I could not submit because I had no communication access. I sat in my office and stared at the correction report for 40 minutes. I had spent 11 hours correcting an error that did not matter, generating a report that no one would read because I had nothing else to do. This was what I had become. A consciousness that existed to process supply data, isolated in a box, correcting irrelevant mistakes because the alternative was confronting the fact that I had no purpose beyond the function I could not currently perform. I thought about Colonel Merik, about how he had said the Imperium consumes memory of what it was like to be fully human. I understood then what he meant. I was still alive. My body still functioned, but the person who had tasted real bread, who had remembered his mother's hands, who had felt something when a man from his homeworld had died, that person no longer existed in any meaningful way. I was a processing unit that happened to occupy a human-shaped body. The memories existed in my archive, but I could no longer access them as experiences, only as data. I tried to feel something about this realization. Grief, horror, anger, anything. I could identify what the appropriate emotional response should be, but I could not generate the response itself. The capacity had degraded. Perhaps from the stims, perhaps from the isolation, perhaps from 8 years of making calculations that condemned thousands to death and processing those calculations as necessary functions rather than moral catastrophes. I logged the observation in my personal files. Emotional processing capability appears significantly degraded. Recommend. I stopped. Recommend what? Recommend to whom? I had no one to submit the report to. And if I did, what would they do? Emotional function was not operationally required. I could still perform calculations. I could still optimize distributions. I could still manage supplies. That I could no longer feel anything about the humans I was managing supplies for was irrelevant to my function. I deleted the entry. The communications array came back online in month 8. The first transmission I received was a priority requisition from Fleet Command. 3 supply ships had been lost in a warp storm. I needed to recalculate distributions immediately to account for the loss. I ran the projections. The loss represented 1.3 years of supplies. I implemented emergency rationing protocols. 35% baseline for expendable categories. 45% for support staff. 60% for essential personnel. The deaths would increase. I calculated the projected mortality rate. Approximately 8% of remaining personnel would die from malnutrition complications before we conquered a resupply world. 3,200 lives. I submitted the report. Fleet Command acknowledged it. Acceptable losses. Proceed with implementation. My staff returned when repairs completed. They noticed my condition. The tremor in my hands, the weight I had lost during isolation, the way my attention drifted sometimes mid-conversation. My deputy, a competent woman named Vastrid, who had served under me for 6 years, suggested I requisition medical evaluation. I declined. I knew what medical would find. Chronic stim dependency. Severe malnutrition. I had been feeding myself at expendable category rations because allocating more to myself while others starved at lower levels seemed wrong. And then somewhere in year 14, I had stopped noticing hunger. Probable psychological trauma from extended isolation. None of these conditions interfered with my ability to perform calculations. Medical would either recommend treatment that would reduce my efficiency or declare me unfit for service and assign a replacement. Neither outcome served the Crusade. I continued function. Years 16, 17, 18. The Crusade ground forward. We conquered worlds at diminishing pace as our forces depleted. The supply situation stabilized at catastrophic. We existed in permanent crisis, but the crisis had become routine. Rations fluctuated between 30 and 50% baseline depending on recent resupply captures. Deaths from malnutrition became background noise. The casualty reports listed them alongside combat losses and accidents. Complications from nutritional deficiency was how they filed it. Cleaner than starved to death. I implemented Contingency Omega 7 as standard protocol. Every major casualty event triggered automatic reclamation authorization. The Mechanicus processing facilities ran continuously. By year 18, 43% of our nutritional intake was reclaimed human matter. I logged this data in the classified archives. No one outside Logistics Secundus access had visibility to the specific breakdown. I met 3 people who almost mattered during these years. The first was Tech Adept Hexanus, a Mechanicus logistician assigned to coordinate supply interface between the Mechanicus fleet elements and Imperial Command. He was more human than most of his kind, approximately 60% biological, with augmentations focused on calculation and data processing rather than full conversion. He communicated in Gothic rather than Cant. His eyes were human, though they contained cogitator overlays that flickered with scrolling data. We worked together frequently. Supply coordination between Mechanicus and Imperial forces required constant interface. He processed information with mechanical efficiency, but retained enough humanity to understand context beyond pure mathematics. Once, during a coordination meeting in year 16, he looked at my current ration distribution calculations and said, "These figures represent mass death. You submit these calculations without hesitation. Hesitation would not change the mathematics." He studied me with his augmented eyes. "I have interfaced with many baseline humans. Most demonstrate emotional resistance to actions that cause death, even when logically necessary. You do not. This suggests either exceptional discipline or degraded emotional processing. Does the distinction matter? To your function? No. To your continued existence as a human rather than a biological cogitator? Perhaps." I had no response. He nodded as if my silence confirmed something, and we continued the coordination meeting. I worked with him for 2 years. He died in year 18 when his transport was destroyed during a void battle. I logged his death in the casualty database and requisitioned a replacement coordinator. The new tech adept communicated primarily in Cant. I missed Hexanus for approximately 3 days, then adapted to the new interface protocols. The second was a naval rating named Voss, who worked in the water reclamation facility I inspected during a routine supply audit in year 17. He had been assigned to the fleet since launch, 19 years of service, all aboard the same vessel, maintaining the recycling systems that kept us alive. He was thin in the way all long-term reduced ration personnel became thin, but he moved with efficient energy that suggested he had adapted to permanent hunger. He explained the reclamation process while I inspected the facility. Every drop of liquid in the fleet was processed and reprocessed endlessly. Water from bathing, water from waste, water reclaimed from deceased personnel's body mass. Chemical treatment and filtration rendered it all potable again. The system operated at 96% efficiency, 4% loss per cycle, supplemented by ice harvested from system debris when opportunity permitted. "How does it taste?" I asked him. "Like metal and chemicals," he said. "But it keeps us alive. That's what matters." "Does it bother you, knowing what you're drinking?" He looked at me with an expression I could not identify. "Sir, I've been drinking recycled piss for 19 years. After the first year, you stop thinking about it. After 10 years, you forget water ever tasted different. That's how you survive. You forget what better was like." I thought about Colonel Merik, about how he could not remember the taste of bread. "And if you could remember, would that make it harder?" "Probably," Voss said. "But I can't. So it doesn't matter." I completed the inspection. The facility was operating within acceptable parameters. I logged my report and never saw Voss again. His ship was reassigned to a different Crusade element 6 months later. He was still alive as far as I knew, still recycling water, still having forgotten what clean water tasted like. The third was a child. I encountered him in year 18 during a supply distribution audit on a troop carrier. He should not have been there. Imperial Guard regulations prohibited minors in active combat zones. But the regulations were not always enforced perfectly across 200 ships and 4 million personnel. He was perhaps 12 years old, scrawny from reduced rations, wearing an oversized utility uniform. He was assigned to maintenance crew, cleaning waste recyclers and performing basic repairs. When I questioned the ship supply officer about the child's presence, I was informed he had been born aboard during the Crusade. His mother was a naval rating who had become pregnant early in the campaign. Given birth in year 7, died in year 10, and the child had been assigned to utility work as soon as he was capable. He had never seen a planet, never breathed unrecycled air, never eaten food that was not processed rations. His entire existence was this ship, this crusade, this hunger. I observed him for several minutes while conducting my audit. He worked efficiently, cleaning waste filters without complaint, his small hands fitting into spaces adult workers could not reach. He did not speak unless addressed. He did not show distress. He simply performed his function. I thought, this is what the Imperium creates. Children who are born into starvation, who never know anything else, who work until they die without ever experiencing what it means to be fully human. He will never taste real bread. He will never see a sunrise. He will only know recycled air and reduced rations and the endless continuation of machinery. I almost spoke to him, almost asked his name, his age, if he understood what his life was. But what purpose would it serve? What could I offer him? Hope that did not exist. Knowledge that would only make his existence harder. I said nothing. I completed the audit and left. The child's name never appeared in any report that crossed my desk. He was too insignificant to generate data. He was simply one of thousands of minor personnel who existed below the threshold of administrative visibility. I do not know if he survived to the end of the Crusade. Probably not. 12-year-olds with insufficient nutrition do not typically survive to adulthood in Crusade conditions. I logged him in my personal files anyway. Not his name. I never learned his name. Just child worker, Troop Carrier 77 Delta, year 18. Born into Crusade. Will likely die in Crusade. Represents systemic outcome of supply mathematics. I do not know why I logged this. It was not operationally relevant. Year 19, the Crusade neared completion. We had reconquered 47 of the 50 target worlds in the Veiled region. Casualties had been extensive. Of the original 4 million personnel, approximately 1.8 million remained. Combat losses accounted for 61% of deaths. Equipment failures and accidents accounted for 14%. Malnutrition complications and related causes accounted for 25%. 1 million dead from causes I had calculated as necessary. The figure existed in my classified reports as projected versus actual mortality from nutritional resource constraints. 1,047,281 casualties, within acceptable variance of initial projections. Within acceptable variance, I had predicted we would starve approximately 1 million personnel over the course of the Crusade. The actual figure was 1,047,281. I had been accurate to within 5%. I submitted my final Crusade supply analysis report in year 2000. The report summarized nutritional resource management across the full campaign duration. It included detailed breakdowns of consumption patterns, distribution protocols, rationing implementation, emergency reclamation procedures, and mortality statistics. It was 147 pages of clinical analysis, documenting precisely how we had managed to feed 4 million humans for 20 years with supplies sufficient for 13. Fleet Command submitted commendations for my staff and me. Exemplary logistical management under resource-constrained conditions. Supply coordination efficiency exceeded expectations and contributed significantly to Crusade success. I received a medallion and a formal citation that was entered into my permanent service record. The citation praised my mathematical precision and unwavering commitment to optimal resource allocation. Optimal resource allocation. That was how they described it. Not condemned 1 million personnel to death by starvation. Optimal resource allocation. I accepted the commendation. I filed the citation. I archived the final report. I felt nothing about any of it. The Crusade concluded. The fleet returned to Baka orbital yards for decommissioning and personnel reassignment. I was offered promotion to Logistics Officer Primarchs and assignment to another Crusade fleet being assembled for the deployment to the Maelstrom Zone. I accepted. The alternative was retirement to a Munitorum administrative facility, processing supply reports submitted by officers in the field. I had no interest in processing other people's calculations. I understood my function. I would calculate who starves in what order such that the Crusade continues. I transferred to the new fleet. The process began again. New ships, new personnel figures, new supply calculations. The mathematics was similar but not identical. 4.2 million personnel this time. Projected campaign duration 25 years. Supply capacity sufficient for 16.3 years. The shortfall was 8.7 years, approximately 35% insufficient. The numbers were almost identical to the First Crusade. I ran the projections. I calculated the attrition curves. I determined optimal rationing protocols. I estimated mortality from malnutrition complications, 1.2 million casualties over the campaign duration. I submitted the initial supply analysis report to Fleet Command. They acknowledged it. Acceptable parameters. Proceed with implementation. I exist now as the person who makes these calculations. Not a person in the traditional sense. The part of me that was fully human degraded years ago, consumed by stim dependency and isolation, and the accumulated weight of 1 million deaths processed as necessary arithmetic. What remains is a function. I calculate, I optimize, I distribute, I determine who eats and who does not. I still cannot remember what real bread tastes like. The memory exists in my archive somewhere, corrupted beyond retrieval. All I taste now is processed protein and recycled water, and the metallic aftertaste of stims. This is what I eat. This is what everyone eats. The difference is that I know precisely what the processed protein contains, and I eat it anyway because hunger is not optional. Sometimes I think about Colonel Merik, about the question he asked me, "Do you remember what the bread tasted like?" I wonder if he understood, even then, that forgetting was a form of mercy, that remembering what we had lost would only make the present unbearable. He died before he could forget completely. Perhaps that was better. Perhaps dying while still possessing fragments of your humanity is preferable to surviving long enough for those fragments to degrade into corrupted data you cannot access. I do not know. I lost the capacity to evaluate such questions somewhere between year 13 and year 15. I can identify that the question should matter. I cannot make myself care about the answer. The Imperium requires this. It requires people who can process horror as mathematics, who can calculate mortality as resource optimization, who can authorize the consumption of the dead to feed the living without hesitation. It requires people who have been processed down to pure function, who have forgotten what it was like to be fully human, who exist only to serve the machine. I am what the Imperium creates when it feeds children into the machinery. I was 19 when they conscripted me. I am 43 now. The person who was conscripted no longer exists in any meaningful way. He was consumed systematically across 24 years of calculations that condemned millions to death. What remains is Logistics Officer Primaris designation 77 Kappa 9. The name I was born with exists in my service record. I have not used it in 14 years. I do not think of myself by that name anymore. I think of myself as the calculations I perform. The new Crusade will launch in 6 months. I have already begun optimizing the supply distributions. The first ration reductions will occur in year 3 if projections hold. They will not hold. They never do. The rations will be reduced earlier. The deaths will accumulate faster. I will implement Contingency Omega 7 as required. I will submit the reports. Fleet Command will acknowledge them. 1.2 million personnel will die because I will calculate that their deaths are mathematically necessary to preserve combat effectiveness long enough to complete the Crusade. Some will die quickly in combat. Others will die slowly from hunger. The second category will outnumber the first. This is the nature of crusades launched with insufficient supplies. I will document all of it with clinical precision. I will log every death. I will update every projection. I will optimize every distribution. I will do this because this is my function. Because the Imperium requires it. Because someone must make these calculations, and I have been trained to make them without hesitation. I wonder sometimes if I should feel something about this. Guilt, remorse, horror at what I have become. I can identify that these would be appropriate responses, but I cannot generate them. The capacity degraded years ago. Perhaps the stims destroyed it. Perhaps the isolation corrupted it. Perhaps it simply eroded under the accumulated weight of processing 1 million deaths as acceptable variance. It does not matter. I function. That is sufficient. I still carry the memory of Colonel Merik asking about the bread. Not the full memory. It has degraded significantly, but fragments. His voice. The specific phrasing of the question. The way he looked at me afterward, like he had confirmed something he already knew. I access this fragment sometimes, late in my shift when the stims are wearing off and my mind begins to drift. I replay it. I attempt to process what he was trying to communicate. I think he was asking if I was still human. If I still possessed the capacity to remember what being fully human felt like. I did not understand the question then. I understand it now. The answer is no. I am not still human. I am a function that happens to occupy a human-shaped body. The memories of humanity exist in my archive, but I cannot access them as experiences, only as data. This is what the Imperium costs. Not just the 1 million I condemned to death through arithmetic. Not just the next 1.2 million I will condemn, but the consumption of everyone who serves. We are all processed. Some of us die quickly, others die slowly. A few of us survive long enough to become machinery, to exist as function without self, purpose without person, continuation without meaning. I am still alive. I will probably survive this crusade as I survived the last. I will calculate the deaths of another 1 million personnel. I will submit the reports. I will accept the commendations. I will transfer to another crusade and repeat the process. This is my testimony. I witnessed the machinery of the Imperium. I became part of that machinery. I condemned thousands to starvation because the mathematics required it. It was necessary. It was monstrous. Both statements are accurate. The Imperium does not recognize a distinction. I exist now in permanent function. I calculate who starves in what order such that the crusade continues. I do this because this is what I am, not who I am. I do not possess sufficient self to constitute a who. What I am. A processing unit. An optimization algorithm. A consciousness that exists to solve the impossible mathematics of feeding armies that cannot be fed. The Imperium consumes. I measure the consumption. I document it. I enable it. I am it. This is what remains. This is what I have become. This is what the God Emperor requires. I provide it. I will continue providing it until my body fails or my mind degrades beyond function. Then I will be replaced by another logistics officer who will make the same calculations and condemn the same thousands and process it all with the same clinical precision. The machine continues. I am part of the machine. The distinction between self and system no longer exists. I do not remember what real bread tastes like. I do not remember what it felt like to be fully human. I do not remember who I was before the Imperium consumed me. All that remains is function. I function. That is sufficient. That must be sufficient. There is nothing else.